You're listening to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach.
Small business owners and farmers are protesting the Korean WTO and NAFTA are transnational forms of autocratic governance that subordinate our
a North American free trade agreement.
Seattle has never seen anything like it.
Mexican workers face threats of violence.
Trade policy has delivered one punch in the gut after another.
Welcome back to Rethinking Trade, where we don't just talk about trade policy, we fight to change it. I'm Ryan, and I'm joined once again by our in-house trade expert, Lori Wallach. Lori, we've all been seeing and consuming tons of news about the coronavirus, but one thing we're not hearing too much about is Mexico. And a lot of the products we use every day are made in Mexico. What's been going on in Mexico?
Well, there is considerable spread of coronavirus there and COVID illness. It started a little bit later than the US, but there was widespread community spread by the beginning of March. On March 30th, the progressive president of Mexico, AMLO, called for a basically shelter-at-home order and shut down all non-essential businesses. This sort of really gruesome story is that a lot of the U.S. corporations that are producing in Mexico, many brand name companies that left the U.S. under NAFTA, have stayed open. And particularly in the northern part of Mexico, what's often known as the Maquiladora zone, the border cities just across from Texas and California and Arizona, there have been considerable horrible outbreaks in factories where social distancing wasn't respected, where personal protective equipment wasn't given to workers. And, where clearly the work was not essential. So one of the stories that has gotten into the US press, because most of it hasn't, is Lear Company. They're making car seats, obviously not essential. Over a dozen workers there died after workers started showing up at the infirmary at the plant saying they had these symptoms, they were sent back to work, etc. Unfortunately, that's not unique. There have been in Honeywell plant, in a Beloit Motors plant, there have been a variety of episodes like that. And there's been a lot of activism, which is, powerful, inspired, where really workers saw the situation as basically corporate greed, NAFTA corporate greed versus their health and life. And a lot of workers against really hard odds in Mexico because you can get beaten up, at least, if not worse, for exercising your labor rights. A lot of workers protested. The really inspiring story, but unfortunately not the norm, is workers at a factory called TPI Composite. They make the wind blades for electric generating windmills. 500 workers went out on strike, and as someone in the plant had died and people were sick, and they got the company to basically furlough them all at full pay. But that is not typical. Most of the places that are closing, it's a struggle to get paid. And also, companies keep popping back up. They're ignoring the orders, or they have sort of complicity with local officials. And if that weren't enough, the US government and US corporations have launched this really intense pressure campaign for the Mexican government and those plants, the Mexican workers, to basically put these corporations' interests ahead of the life and health of the Mexican workers. And National Association of Manufacturers sent a letter. The U.S. ambassador to Mexico has just played a really evil role. He's been pressuring the government with threats that the U.S. companies will just take off and produce elsewhere if they don't reopen those companies, regardless of the health. And maybe one of the most outrageous things he said was in a tweet. "There are risks everywhere," said Chris Landau, "but we don't all stay at home for fear we're going to get in a car accident. The destruction of the economy is also a health threat." As if somehow going to work to make non-essential goods so a U.S. company can profit at a time when the outbreak in Mexico is growing, is equivalent to the threat of a car accident. versus sort of, industrial suicide by being forced into a dangerous situation. That is the situation, and the Mexican government has been uneven in its response. In some respects, it stood up to this pressure, and in some instances, it suggested that it will basically be reopening soon.
Speaking of labor laws in Mexico and labor standards in Mexico, one of the reasons that we're talking about this on our podcast about trade is because the new NAFTA is going into effect on July 1st. And within the new NAFTA, there are new and somewhat significant labor standards that have also coalesced with labor law reform in Mexico. Maybe you can talk about what those standards look like and what this current situation might mean for the new NAFTA's implementation.
So the new NAFTA is slated to go into effect on July 1st in all three countries. And there could not be a less auspicious time, because the improved labor standards and the really landmark enforcement system on paper in the agreement that the Congressional House Democrats forced the administration to add. So, folks remember in 2018, the NAFTA 2.0 text came out, and the Democrats said, no, the labor and environmental standards aren't sufficient, nor their enforcement to stop outsourcing. It'll just get worse. Plus, there are outrageous new giveaways for pharma. So the House Democrats basically drew a line in the sand, and there was almost a year-long stare down, and ultimately the administration backed down and renegotiated NAFTA. So the deal that's going to go into effect in July 1 has some useful improvements. But like everything in life, there's what's on paper, and then there's what actually happens. So there are at least three factors. And when I say it's really inauspicious, this is happening during COVID, it's because some of it's going to be disrupted by the priority necessarily on the COVID response. So number one, there are a bunch of court challenges against a new Mexican labor law that was passed to basically bring Mexican labor law into conformity with the obligations in the agreement. So under current Mexican labor law, there's what's called a tripartite system. And there is a lot of power in the state level in each Mexican state. So that, for instance, if there are conservative governments that support the business perspective, the tripartite system is one sort of the decisions about whether contracts are legit, et cetera. It's one union person, one business person, one government person. So already you've got the prospect of the business people and the government people on the wrong side of the workers. But then under Mexican labor law, there has not been under the old law, a way to ensure Mexican workers are actually voting to elect their own unions. So there's this plague of what are called protection contracts, which are contracts typically signed before the first worker enters into the plant between the boss and these sort of racket unions. They're paid to do a contract to satisfy the requirements of Mexican law, but the workers don't get to vote on it. The function is to protect the boss and have low wages. So there's 700,000 of those protection contracts. And one of the things that's in the Mexican new reform labor law is revoting those. And the NAFTA requires they're all reaffirmed over the period of 4 years so that the fake contracts get dumped and people get real unions. And then how is it going to be decided if the contract's really been revoted and there's a real union contract there? It's more of the same fake stuff. There are a bunch of new institutions that have to be set up. And so the new Mexican labor law sets up the institution, sets up those new rights, and it's been challenged over 400 lawsuits. Some have been dismissed, but a bunch are still going forward, and they're not getting decided because just like in the US, the courts are basically shut down for anything but urgent criminal matters. So the labor law itself is still a little bit up in the air, and that is sort of necessary for the reforms to go into effect. But then the second thing is a whole bunch of new institutions need to get set up. And that involves the U.S. actually coming through with that funding it promised to help do that and some additional staffing and support, but also the Mexican government, which promised to increase funding and then promised to establish a bunch of new, really national labor relations board type institution to replace these state level tripartite bodies. And so the national system is still plugging ahead, But obviously, in the way of every country, plugging ahead with resources diverted to COVID, with priorities of everyone. I mean, obviously, with all the worker safety issues, the Labor Department is as focused on emergency labor, worker safety issues in COVID as they can be on trying to set up these new institutions. And then the third piece of it has to do with really the kind of oversight and political and press, really, if you will, spotlighting of what's going on. And pretty much everything is COVID, COVID, COVID. So even some of the high profile labor disaster situations, like at Goodyear, where a lot of workers were locked out who tried to have an independent union, and members of Congress who went to investigate what got locked out, that's not been resolved. Some of the outrageous conduct in call centers has not been resolved vis-a-vis contracts. At least there's been now a criminal case filed against a call center in Mexico City that was staying open even as workers were getting sick. But there's just not the level of focus or attention by civil society, by parliamentarians here or in Mexico, by the press. So all of those things leave a slightly, a less auspicious likelihood of the kind of improvements we were hoping for, and we're all going to have to stay on it.
It's interesting because we're actually watching in real time a labor law reform through a trade agreement happening, and it's pretty compelling. So why is this something, do you think, that people should be paying close attention to? And, what does it mean for the future of North American work?
So we keep hearing in the context of COVID, we're all in this together. And that is an entirely true slogan with respect to workers' wages, conditions, futures in North America. Because we are so integrated after 25 years of NAFTA, for U.S. workers and the recovery that's going to have to happen economically, given the wreckage being caused by the COVID disaster, as we think about both how jobs are going to be restored, what wage levels will be available, but also we think about how we rebuild our resilience, our ability to make the basic things we desperately need to be safe, both the medical goods that we found ourselves unable to make or get, but also thinking forward to the next potential disaster, be it, infrastructure related or weather related, the other ways in which we are, thanks to the system of hyperglobalization, really not resilient in the face of almost any crisis. Part of the answer to that is a North American answer to move some of that production out of China. Obviously, a bunch of it needs to come domestically to the US, but also with respect to what's going to happen with workers here and wages here. This NAFTA rewrite experiment of improved labor standards and enforcement has got to be made to work. Because unless wages rise in Mexico, the prospect for U.S. workers having decent wages and or manufacturing being situated in the U.S. for that 2/3 of the workforce that does not have a college degree, that many of whom had previously a middle-class union manufacturing job, it is not an either or. It's not the jobs are in Mexico or the jobs are here. As we've seen with this crisis, we don't have any redundancy. Everything's been moved to one plant far away. If that plant goes down or we need a bigger supply, we're just stuffed. So this is a moment to think about how we rebuild the manufacturing sector in the US, but in North America as well, with redundancy and resilience and distribution of jobs in more countries. And so making sure that those hard-fought labor standards in NAFTA and their enforcement actually make a difference is every damn person's business in the United States, not just in Mexico.
That's all for today. Thank you all for listening. Rethinking Trade is produced by Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. I would encourage you to visit rethinktrade.org as well as tradewatch.org to educate yourself and to find out how you can get involved in the work we're doing to fight for fairer and more equitable trade policies.